So I want to welcome everyone to our funder webinar, Youth Strategies to Unlock Foundation Funding for Youth Organizing. I'm Eric Braxton. I'm the Executive Director of the Funders Collaborative on Youth Organizing. We're really excited to have you all on this webinar today. Since FCYO started, part of our mission has been to encourage greater investment in youth organizing from philanthropy. And there's a lot of things that we've tried to as ways to do that over the years. There have been a few different kind of narrative frameworks that we've used. But last year, we decided to hire a team of consultants from Wonder Strategies for Good and the Movement Strategy Center to help us identify who are the new funders that are most likely to be interested in supporting youth organizing in this moment, what messages resonate with them, and how should we be communicating with them. So they've just completed doing this research project, and we at FCYO will be using these findings to guide our own funder advocacy and communications work. But we also wanted to share these findings with groups on the ground and hope that they will be helpful to you in your fundraising efforts. We know that the last few years have been really tough for raising money for youth organizing. We know that a lot of groups are struggling. But at the same time, we've also seen that there have been some signs of change, of new interest in youth organizing from funders over the last year or so. So we hope that with the right advocacy strategy on our part and supporting groups to understand how to reach new funders, that we can see some new resources for the important work that you all are doing that can last and help sustain organizations for the long term. So with that, I want to introduce the team that's going to lead the webinar that's been doing this research, which includes Carolyn Laub and Scott Nine from Wonder Strategies for Good and Taj James from the Movement Strategy Center. So with that said, let me just turn it over to Carolyn, Scott, and Taj.
Thank you, Eric. We've really appreciated having the opportunity to work on this project. All of us who are presenting today have come out of youth organizing ourselves and cared really deeply about this central question here, which is how can we help unlock more funding for youth organizing across the sector. So it's a really great opportunity to be able to do this work with the Funders Collaborative on Youth Organizing. So I'll just turn us over to turn the slides over so you can see what we're going to do today. We're going to start with some introductions of the three of us who are presenting and give an overview of the shared narrative project that we've engaged in that Eric's introduced for today. And then we've got a set of findings from our research that we'll each be sharing different sections. We're going to talk about the mindsets of funders, and that'll lead us into a brief activity about how to identify persuadable funders. And then we're going to dig into some of the findings that we learned through this process about the right kinds of messengers and the right messages to be sharing with foundation program officers and foundations to be able to increase the kind of foundation funding for the youth organizing work that all of you are doing. And we'll do another activity to identify persuadable funders and move into some of our recommendations. And then we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. So let me just turn over, let's do a quick introductions just about who we are. And then we'll also do some housekeeping as folks are, I can see people are still joining the call. So we'll give everybody another minute or two to keep joining, and then we'll talk about how this will work. So I'll just say a little bit about myself. I'm was the founder and longtime executive director of the Gay Straight Alliance Network for 16 years, a youth organizing group working with LGBTQ youth around the country. And I think there's some folks from the GSA network movement that are here on the call today. So it's nice to see you all. I left a couple of years ago. I'm doing consulting now, and one of my consulting opportunities is with the Wonder Strategies for Good. It's a network of strategic communications consultants, and I'm thrilled to be part of that network, which has been a big, and Wonder has been a big part of this project. So I'm going to turn it over to Taj from Movement Strategy Center to say a little bit about the Movement Strategy Center and about yourself.
Good morning, good afternoon, or depending on where you are. I'm Taj, and I'm with Movement Strategy Center. And for the last 15 years or so, we've been working with folks to help build stronger social justice movements by strengthening organizing, community organizing, helping folks to build strong and powerful networks and collaborations around their work, and also helping to work with philanthropy to better understand what social movements are, what organizing is, why it's important, and how to invest in it. So it's been a lot of fun working with the Wonder team to really listen to all of you and other folks in the field to kind of find out what's really working and to try to bring together all that wisdom into one place so we can have some more conversations about it and see how we can strengthen our practice around what's working. So excited for the conversation. Scott?
Hey everybody, my name's Scott Nine, and I'm a tweener. I'm part Wonder for Good, part Movement Strategy Center. 18 months ago, I became a consultant doing lots of different strategic work, mostly in the world of education. 5 years before that, I was the executive director of a nonprofit organization called IDEA, and really entered the world of education organizing and a lot of listening and paying attention to what's going on in different parts of the US and in Puerto Rico. And bring a background that's kind of thinking about how we communicate, how we organize funders, and how you unlock resources. Excited to kind of bring that mix as a kind of strategist and small part of this project, and look forward to the conversation today.
Great. So just as let's do a brief minute here on some housekeeping. Everyone who has joined the call, except for the presenters, are muted. And so I want to encourage everyone to open up the group chat. If you don't have it open already, if you look at the bottom bar of your Fuse screen, you can open up the dialog box and that'll show the group chat that's going on. And we invite everyone to introduce themselves. You can say your name and organization, and then answer our question prompt to get started by saying what you've tried. You know, what messages have you tried to use in persuading funders to support youth organizing. So we're collecting those and listening to those as folks are joining the call today. If you do have a clarifying question, please type that into the group chat as well. And Eric and Will, who are here on the call from FCYO, will signal to us that as presenters that there's a clarifying question that's really important to answer before we can move on. Otherwise, we will have a Q&A at the very end, again, using the group chat to generate a set of questions and ideas, and hear from all of you about how your thoughts on this, on the findings, and how this might apply to your work and what you'd be doing in your own communities. I also wanted to just remind everyone that there were a set of materials that we sent in advance, and we are going to talk briefly about the materials, but not at length. So do take a look at those if you haven't already. They're pretty quick to read and digest if you haven't yet looked at them. So with that, I'm going to get started with giving an overview about what we did in the Shared Narrative Project. Oh, there's the three of us again. But you can see us obviously on your screen. I know there's a few people who may be joining just by phone, so we'll try to make sure we are describing what we're projecting in the presentation. So I want to start sort of with historically. Eric, when he did his introduction, mentioned that historically there have been other frames for youth organizing that certainly that FCYO and many others have used and tried. In particular, I think early on, many years ago, the description of the way we talked about youth organizing is that it was youth development plus community organizing. And that really is a frame that focuses on the sort of the how of what we did in youth, what we do in youth organizing, is developing young people and engaging in community organizing. Another frame that has been used and tried to persuade funders to support youth organizing is to talk about it as an opportunity to build a leadership pipeline. Certainly, that's true today. Both of these frames are still true today, but they have reached some, the limitations of their usefulness in being able to persuade new funders at this particular moment to be able to fund the work that we are all engaged in and you are all engaged in. So the challenge for us in this project that FCYO engaged Wonder and Movement Strategy Center is to answer this kind of key question: how can we develop a new shared narrative around youth organizing in order to increase funding for the field at this moment? So that's a very important question. As I think Eric mentioned, it's been a struggle in the last several years, and so to raise money for youth organizing, and those previous frames have worked in some cases, but there's still many funders that we wanted to explore the possibility of whether or not we could engage them and bring them on board to fund the kind of work that you all are doing. And then the question would be how to do that. So the project goals for the Shared Narrative Project are to increase sustainable funding for youth organizing, awareness of youth organizing, a commitment to youth organizing, and the influence of youth organizing. So how we set about doing that first was to really prioritize who are the potential target audiences for this endeavor. We brainstormed lots and lots of different types of funders that where there might be some opportunities or connection, and depending on the size of the pot of money that represented, we narrowed our search, and we narrowed the focus on the target audiences through our research initially by testing a set of hypotheses about these funders. We narrowed that to a set of primary audiences. The youth development and education funders represent a huge pot of money for youth organizers to potentially tap into. And there's real questions that we wanted to engage in the research about how we could persuade those types of funders, which are not themselves a monolithic group. They represent a wide range of different type of funders, but that became one of the key audiences for us to target in this project. And then the second primary audience that we looked at and discovered through our research was that community foundations, small family foundations, and local or regional Southern community funders, so funders that are really focused on funding at a particular community level, are also a potentially key audience for us to persuade in doing youth organizing work. I'll just mention that the secondary audiences that we had also considered, but have not focused on in terms of the messengers and messages that we're going to share back with you today in our findings were the ones you see listed on the right-hand side: the New Wealth donor networks and donor-advised funds, social justice funders, a group of funders that are investing in boys and men of color and girls and women of color, and civic engagement funders. And just to say about that group, it doesn't mean that they don't fund youth organizing. In fact, some of them already are funding youth organizing, and are already with us, like the social justice funders. But there's a limited number of them. And so in terms of the potential that they represent to really unlock new foundation funding for youth organizing, these secondary audiences were not the focus of the research that we engaged in, the messages that we tested. So instead, we really sort of looked for the nexus of, who are the potential funders that we could persuade that also represent a huge untapped potential pot of money for the work that we're doing. And I want to share a little bit about our process and how we approached the work and doing the research. And just to kind of give you some of our thinking behind the scenes, we were really focused on, we're sort of aware that the early adopters, if you've ever seen this slide before, this graph, it's a description of like what's known as social diffusion theory. And so it's sort of a curve where you can see that a small percentage of, in this case, we're thinking about funders, are the innovative funders that already understand and sort of have been funding youth organizing from the outset. So we were looking also then at the early adopters, those funders that are already investing in youth organizing, who've been influenced by the innovators. And then the early majority, those are the funders that can be persuaded to begin investing in youth organizing, and they became the target audience for this shared narrative project. So those are the groups that we focused on in terms of the interviews that we did and the funders that we targeted for testing the materials that that we developed in the project. And how we did the research itself, we didn't make it up. We're not just, a group of consultants sitting around inventing what we think will work. We actually wanted to know what our audiences, our target audiences think, and how they think about, how they make decisions about the funding that they're doing. So we did several rounds of in-depth interviews, both with early adopter funders, to test our hypotheses about the audiences that we had early on in the project. And then we did a couple of rounds of interviews with the early majority funders, so funders that came from youth development, education, and community foundations. So that's where we were really testing the messages, including some of those materials that we've shared with you in advance. Like a narrative about sort of a broad narrative about youth organizing, as well as some example stories that might be used in a newsletter. So we'll get into that in a few moments. We also did an online survey with funders. Those early majority funders were targeted, and that included open-ended qualitative responses to test the messages with a larger group of funders.
Hey, Carolyn, real quick, Barbara in the chat asks, could you give an example or two of an early majority funder or organization?
So a lot of those were funders that are interested in outcomes for K-12 students, in increasing academic achievement outcomes, youth development funders, so funders that are funding after-school programs and the like. So a number of funders that, community foundations that fund youth development programs in their local community, but maybe are not yet funding youth organizing specifically or explicitly. Great, I'm glad that answered the question. Great question, thanks, Scott. What I wanted to share with you in terms of just sort of at a broad level, the executive summary from our project was that we were successful in identifying kind of the mindsets, the types of funders who are most and who are least likely to be persuaded, so that as youth organizers, your time is very limited, and we want to share with you what we've learned about those mindsets of funders so that you can use your time wisely to focus on the potential funders that are most likely to be persuaded. And then we're going to talk about the persuasion strategies and the findings that we uncovered in this project. We developed successful narrative and storytelling strategies that can persuade those target audiences to consider funding youth organizing, and that includes both the messages and the messengers. So we're going to talk about both. They are both vitally important. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Taj to dig into our first set of findings about the mindsets of funders.
Thanks, Carolyn. So as social change actors and advocates, the folks on this call, you all do what you do by building relationships, by listening to folks, by making connections, by understanding how people think, how they feel, what they're excited about, what they're upset about, and then help people sort of make connections around points of common concern, shared hope, shared vision. And the process that we're exploring here is just an extension of that core strength, that core capacity that all of you have, which is about building relationships. So when our goal in this case is to try to move resources, then we have to build relationships with the people who are making decisions about those resources. We have to understand how they think, what they care about, why they think what they think, if we want to develop the kinds of relationships through which we can be persuasive, through which we can help to shift and shape their action and behavior. So one of the ways of doing that is really understand how people think, why they think the way they think, and how that influences their behavior. So this notion of mindset sort of comes from that. And some of you may have heard of the term super predator. In the early 90s, and that has come back lately because we have someone running for president who used that term at one time, and that's become a question of controversy. There's a moment in which that was a very important and significant way that young people were being talked about. And that term is a reflection of a mindset. It's the notion that young people are essentially a danger to the community. They're sort of threats to be managed and protected from. And it's a way of othering young people and separating them out from the rest of us, right? So it's both an othering frame and a divisive frame. But we see a lot of that kind of thinking still present in a lot of the institutions that relate to and deal with young people. So over the years, in the fields and sectors that care about youth, those perceptions have been really shifting over time. And it was the development of the whole field of youth development and positive youth development that really started to advance that shift over the last 20 or 30 years. So in many institutions in philanthropy and in community institutions, there was a big push to try to shift from seeing young people as problems, that, pregnancy waiting to happen, violence waiting to happen, young people as threats to the community, as deficits, to starting to see young people as assets, as people in the community who have a contribution to make, and folks who have sort of inherent value that needs to be developed, recognized, and advanced. And the sort of shifting folks from a deficit orientation to an asset orientation, you can kind of think of as the sort of first primary big shift in mindsets. Like, if you haven't made that shift, then you can't get very much farther than that. So that's the first big and really important shift. As that work has developed, the asset mindset has been sort of questioned and critiqued in the sense that it doesn't necessarily recognize young people's full power and agency. The young people aren't just sort of developing human beings, but they actually have the sort of rights and capacities to participate now, not just in the future, in the sort of processes of shaping our future. That young people have a voice, their voices matter, and they should be a part of the processes that shape their lives and shape decisions. So there's been a shift within the youth, youth development, positive youth development orientation, to recognize sort of the voice and leadership of young people. So there's a whole set of institutions that have sort of shifted to kind of thinking about and recognizing the importance of youth voice. And when we think about on the sort of diffusion curve that Carolyn walked us through, a lot of the most sort of persuadable and influenceable folks that we're dealing with are generally either they're already in the asset space or they're strongly in the voice space. And so when we recognize and we can sort of understand where they are along that spectrum, then we can really find ways of talking to them that help them kind of move to the next part of the cycle. Because the next part of the cycle is not only that young people have a voice, but reflected in a lot of the work that you do, the young people should actually be a part of the decision-making process. They should not just be heard, but they should actually have power along with their communities in shaping their conditions in their schools and in their lives and for their families and for their futures. And so that the core of what youth organizing is really an affirmation. It's really a mindset around youth and community power and recognizing the full, not just humanity of young people, but the essential need to have young people be full parts of decision-making and democratic process in our society. So a lot of the work that we're going to be doing here is really about listening to people in a way that you can kind of understand their mindset, find a way to sort of connect with them and help them to kind of shift their mindset along this continuum. Let's see. So there were a couple key findings that emerged in the conversations that we had with people in terms of identifying who can be persuaded and how they can be persuaded. And this first finding is from an interview with one of the education funders. So just sort of take a moment to sort of read the quote and then some of the findings in relationship to this quote, because it really helps us to see and identify who are the folks who, if we connected them in the right way, we can move them along, we can make it more likely that they'll be partners and investors in youth organizing. What you'll see as you read the quote, and this is from a program officer who we interviewed. You can see them describing how they would sort of frame the issue, right? And what they're listing up is that their foundation, this education foundation, has a set of outcomes that they're focused on, right? And so this person was suggesting that you make a connection between the education outcomes that the foundation's already committed to and the power of youth voice and civic leadership and organizing as a way to move those specific outcomes. And that's one of the kind of essential core elements of the findings, that folks were most persuadable, particularly folks who had a specific outcome orientation, when we could talk about youth, tell a story about youth voice or youth engagement or youth leadership in a way that it was a pathway to achieve a specific outcome. And that's one of the hugest findings that coming out of the research. The next finding is that there are, as we sort of alluded to before, audiences that really cannot be persuaded, and once you're in a conversation and you realize you're talking to someone who's really pretty stuck in a deficit mindset, it's not the best use of your time to try to move them along. And there's a couple foundations who sort of fall into these categories. Those who are kind of focused on a single strategy or a single issue are harder to persuade. If they're just focused on, learning objectives for third graders between the ages of 4 and, some founders are very kind of micro-focused on a small set of systems or outcomes, and those are hard funders to persuade. Those who are bringing, as I said, like a deficit approach to young people, not really worth a lot of your time. And those who just don't really think young people should have a voice and should have power because they're still sort of developing, they're not really full human beings, again, not a good use of your time. And there's still a lot of those folks out there, but fewer and fewer all the time. So there's a lot of folks who've abandoned those mindsets and are, have moved on to a more positive orientation. The thing that's really important in terms of recognizing how we as a field have been talking about youth organizing is that that's usually where the conversation starts. We start by saying, we're excited about youth organizing, and then let me tell you about it. And one of the big findings here, and it relates both to finding 1 and finding 2, is that talking about the outcomes that a particular foundation is trying to reach first, and then talking about how young people's voice and participation is a strategy to move towards those outcomes is one of the things you'll be hearing about more as we get later into the findings. So here's another quote, and you can take a moment to read from a community foundation funder who expresses some of the challenges of moving this agenda. And it sort of speaks to the issue of how foundations work. Because oftentimes there's the institution, and you may be dealing with an individual or a person who may share your worldview, may share your mindset, may believe deeply in the power of young people's voice and participation. But they may be functioning in an institution in which the trustees or the board don't share that commitment. And so part of the question is figuring out how to both assess the person that you're talking to and understand the nature of the institution that they're working in. Because sometimes what we found is that when an ally in an institution has been sort of successful in advancing these perspectives and moving these arguments forward, once that person leaves, that work isn't sustained because there isn't a commitment at the board and the institutional level to sort of invest and commit to young people sort of in this way in the long term. So that's one of the places where we have to be be judicious about where we focus our energy in terms of which institutions are going to make longer-term commitments. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at sort of two statements that were, the names of the foundations are anonymous, but they're actually drawn from actual foundations who were a part of this research process. And we're going to be looking at two questions. Like when you're sort of thinking about spending some time trying to persuade one foundation or another, how do you make an assessment about which foundation might be most persuadable? So once you read the statements, I'm going to ask you to kind of first sort of make a judgment about which one you think is most likely to make a real commitment, make a sustained commitment in youth organizing, given what we've just sort of talked about in terms of mindsets. And then once you've done that, take a minute to sort of figure out what aspect of their work, what piece of what they're doing is sort of a connection point. And the folks at Wonder talk about this as the intersection of the Venn diagram. And at one side of the Venn diagram is what the foundation cares about. And then the other circle is what you care about. And the intersection is you want to start the conversation at the point at which those two things intersect. The point at which what they care about and what you care about intersect. So you can, in an authentic way, talk about the work that you're doing and you care about, and get them to give you money to do it. That's the secret. So, so we're going to take a minute to sort of read through those things. These two, the mythical MKG Foundation and the Owens Family Foundation. So just take a minute to read the two and think about which one of these is most persuadable. Once you've had a chance to do that, put your vote in the group chat and lay out a way that you would try to make a connection, some connection between something you're actually doing in your work right now that connects to something that this foundation cares about. How would you sort of frame or present a piece of your work that's right at that intersection? So I'm going to give you a moment to read and reflect, and we'll see sort of what flows in the chat.
And just one quick note, Funder B, the Owens Family Foundation, mentions that they focus on Chicago. But for the sake of the exercise, just pretend that they are a family foundation in whatever community you're working in. And there's no right or wrong answer to this, so don't feel any test pressure. and folks are starting to weigh in on the chat, and there's sort of an avalanche of votes in terms of at this point in terms of Funder B, and Barbara is reflecting that they seem persuadable because they seem flexible. And Gloria is also seeing the flexibility, and I think that's really it really reflects that, you know, in the work that a lot of you do, you're thinking about young people holistically. You're thinking about communities holistically. Even if you're organizing around education or environmental issues, you all approach that work in a very holistic way. So foundations that also have a kind of holistic approach, or a whole person, whole community approach, there's a lot more places and ways to kind of make connections there. So I think that's definitely something that's been affirmed in the interviews and research that was in the process. Rachel also pointed out that there's sort of more of a orientation in Funder B to systems change. And that gets back to one of the core messages that we're going to be sort of talking about soon, that the ability to kind of talk about how youth organizing both helps young people to grow and develop individually
and advances systems change. That's sort of a 2-for-1. That's one of the kind of messages that we're going to be hearing more about that was the most persuasive. So you all are already kind of pulling out as an example some of the things that were affirmed in the research. That's really like a critical combination. We've got a couple folks saying Funder A, because they already integrate youth development and community improvement. I think, Carolyn, this is maybe a good place for Carolyn's story, or Eric's story actually, where the Funders Collaborative was talking to a large national foundation that really was considering making an investment in youth organizing. And I'm going to, put Eric on Front Street and the team for a second. And they were saying, yeah, youth organizing this, and here's how youth organizing. And then the program officer was like, Eric, stop. Our foundation doesn't care about the field of youth organizing. We care about racial justice. So you have to tell your story in a way that you're talking about racial justice as what you're doing, the outcome you're producing. And that youth organizing is the process to produce that outcome. And that little exchange is sort of at the heart of a lot of what we need to do. We need to switch the order that we tell the story. Sometimes say we're doing youth organizing in order to advance racial justice. And the difference between getting a check and not getting a check is just switching the order. We care about racial justice, and here's how we're using youth organizing as a strategy to advance it. Like that difference in the order of the sentence in the story is the difference between getting a check and not getting a check. And Eric can say more about that, but wanted to pick up on the folks who were sort of seeing the connections in A. My colleagues, anything else we should do with this before we move on to the next slide? Feels like we've milked this for some good, juicy stuff here.
This is great, Taj. Thanks. I think we should move on in the interest of time so we can dig into some of the other findings.
All right.
All right. So picking up from there, you've got you're thinking with your kind of strategic hat on and some empathy and thinking about the mindset of the funders and who's more persuadable. And then the next two findings I'm going to share are really around findings about who delivers the message, which is around the messengers. We'll tease the messages for the last set of findings. So the third finding, but the first one related to messengers, is that these messages, when we tested them with youth organizers, because we didn't just reach out and test funders, but we also wanted to check in with youth organizers to see how the types of messages that we're going to share resonate with folks. And also these are in the materials that were emailed to you ahead of time. There's a narrative framework that if those of you who have those things could be looking at. And what we found was that they tested well. Folks could align very quickly with the ideas of the ways they speak about power, you can get a sense of the strategic nature of the messages. And folks recognize that they're already practicing a kind of code switching. We haven't talked about code switching yet, but one of the underneath findings we found is this idea. If folks aren't familiar with this concept, I think probably it often comes up in terms of thinking from a kind of equity standpoint or a cultural standpoint, where you feel like there's a dominant language and discourse. There's how you would normally talk in your most comfortable way, and you would kind of code switch in order to be able to kind of navigate through a system or kind of through particularly kind of dominant power systems. And as a kind of similar thing here, and what Taj was just talking about is this need to kind of potentially code switch to unlock funding, figure out not only what people care about, but also how to communicate them. We heard from young people, they're already doing that. So there was a sense that could feel comfortable. But the other part of the finding was that there was also a sense that there would need to be some training. And this is one you'll want to pay attention to, because if you decide to follow these recommendations, you're going to want to think about how could you support the young folks that you work with around the implementation of these approaches. And so what we found was there were a couple of things that jumped out that would need some additional attention. One of those is that the organizers can find it hard when funders their mindset about scale simply means increasing numbers and not thinking about it in other ways. Also hard is the ways that the dominant language, particularly around using kind of a corporate language around investment portfolios and return on investment, can feel kind of off-putting. And this is where some work may be done, where you've got to really figure out what do those terms mean. This is kind of in a way taking your organizing framework and putting it into a organizing. Think about you're the ones organizing the funders, and so you've got to find what language resonates with them. And this is where that code switching kind of comes in. And so that's just the kind of primary piece of that finding. And then the second finding around messaging. Oh, I'm sorry. There's a couple quotes, and just a couple to pull out rather than to read them. The first quote, one of the highlights is in the bottom, is that the youth organizer basically says they can see themselves in the narrative, and it helps them return to questions about power. And in the second quote, the one that really resonated with me, is this framework. This is just like an organizing campaign. They talked about their approach of the funders as thinking about all of the core strengths Taj mentioned earlier as youth organizers, and how they think about funders from an organizing campaign. So thinking about the relationships, what they care about, and how to influence them. So that's this third finding. I'm going to just quickly look at this final slide here, which is again kind of like a why does this work? But given that we're kind of short on time, I'll just highlight one thing, which is on the right column. Why this works is again coming back to one of the core underpinnings of this work is this twofer concept. And many of you actually, and when you got on the chat from the beginning, said you're doing this. You're linking the individual growth of the young people that are organizing and the ways it relates to big lasting change or systemic change. A lot of you pointed to that as messaging you're using. This work certainly affirms that that's a good direction to be going. To switch to the next finding, again, also around messengers, is that we found it's really important to be persuaded to fund youth organizing. Funders need to hear from their peers and from young people. And this actually comes with a third kind of bonus recommendation, but I'm going to start with the first one. Funders need to hear from their peers. You can think about how powerful with young people it is to hear from a peer. Turns out funders aren't that different. It really helps to hear from another funder. And a quick story from my own background. Several years ago, actually, one of our partners on the research team is a former funder named Robert Sherman. And I was a nonprofit executive director looking for funding. And it turned out I didn't know Robert Sherman at all. People kept telling me that he and the foundation he was with at the time might be interested in funding our work, but I didn't have a point of contact or access. But I had a close relationship who knew someone who knew him well, and they introduced me, and then I got that peer person to introduce me to Robert Sherman while we simultaneously ran through all the official channels to try to kind of get on their radar screen. And so when we finally had a first meeting, I had done a lot of homework about the foundation, but also about Robert, but I'd also had this introduction from a relationship that made a big difference. And I think the way that meeting took place and that first point of contact. So that's a kind of example of thinking about how to kind of set up that peer relationship. One quick implementation tip on there is like you may meet a funder who loves your work, but is not in a position based on what their foundation is resourcing to be able to support you. And rather than taking that as just a no, you may want to be holding a question, which is, okay, I hear that you can't fund this right now, but could you be a resource or a champion or an advocate for us with other funders? And to kind of have in your way that you keep resources of funders, folks who could be good peer advocates for you. You might begin to build that kind of organizational cue for yourselves because it shows that that can be quite effective. The other half of the finding is that they also, though, need to hear directly from young people. And they need to hear those stories. You could see in the support materials in the funder story that was shared, that hearing directly from young people, getting to go on site visits, getting to feel and see really makes a difference. Finally, the kind of bonus tip is actually funders really also appreciate hearing from the adults involved. So whether that's the adult leaders or advocates in your organization, or it's teachers seeing the benefits of what the organizing young people are doing, that's kind of the bonus third person that builds a bit of a surround for funders to kind of make sense of the work. The next slide just has a little quote here, kind of an in-depth interview. And again, one of the things that jumps out here is the idea that getting to see some struggle, not having everything be perfect, can actually build some credibility to your ask. And that's partly to tell you, don't be afraid of having site visits. And it also means don't be afraid of telling more complicated stories. Those things can actually be helpful for folks to kind of get into the grittiness of the work that you're doing, and can help them get attracted. And then finally, this last slide articulates again, in those additional materials was a campaign story, a true story with some changed names and places, about the work of 30 young people to impact 300,000, and gives you again just a sense of being able to go from individual impact to systemic impact, looking at multiple points of access and who's delivering the message, and ways that you can get everyone connected. So to kind of make the handoff to Carolyn, Taj has shared kind of how do you get connected to the mindsets, and I've shared a couple findings about how the messengers matter. And now I'm going to hand it off to Carolyn, who's going to actually take you through the messages that we found were most helpful.
Thanks, Scott. And I'll stay on this slide for 1 second and just, go back to something Taj said earlier, that one of the challenges that or maybe you said this, Scott, one of the challenges that youth organizers face is when you have a funder whose mindset is all about numbers and reaching and scale to them means reaching more and more and more young people. And yet, as youth organizers, we might have a core group of 20 or 30 young people that we're working with over time, and it's very intensive work, where they're gaining a lot individually as leaders in their own development, but we're not reaching 400 young people through an after-school program. And yet the promise of what we can do when we create systemic change is to then impact the lives of hundreds of thousands, thousands or hundreds of thousands of young people. And that's what this story does. In addition to really just hearing from the right kinds of messengers, young people and peers and adults, this is also the story that we tested also shows how that small number of youth can create impact at scale, and that can be very compelling to funders. So I'm going to move us along into the next set of findings, which is really about the details in the messages themselves. And so you've heard from Taj about the mindsets, and heard from Scott on the messengers that are just as important as the messages. And I know a lot of folks are really, when you think about sort of strategic communications approaches, really curious about the actual messages, what works. And the core concept I want to share with you today, and the core finding, is that messages really need to be emotionally attuned to the target audience. And this has been foreshadowed in a lot of what Taj and Scott have already talked about. So this first idea of the Venn diagram, leading with the outcomes that funders are looking to accomplish, is that are also aligned with what you are accomplishing, is really the key strategy here. Leading with the why. Why are we doing the work? What are we going to be accomplishing? Rather than leading with the process of how we do the work by organizing young people. So that is really one of the key findings, and it is emotionally attuned to what funders really care about. So that's important to lead with. And then in particular, what resonated with some things that we tested in the messages and through the survey was, and this is perhaps counterintuitive to the way that we're used to doing this as youth organizers, but the phrase young people working together to improve their community was a much stronger description than youth organizing. And so I want to just linger on that for a minute to say part of what we are up against in that mindset is a flawed mental template among many of the individual adults that we're talking to, who are program officers at foundations or the trustees of the foundations, who are, have an idea of what youth organizing is. And we heard this from the interviews, that they may think of youth organizing as a big group of youth with signs protesting, marching in the streets. And if that's their only idea of what youth organizing is, that seems really counter to the kind of programs and outcomes that they are interested in funding. So we actually have to start with other kinds of vivid, concrete language to explain what youth organizing is, to give a sense of what it is and not get caught up in using the jargon that we are most comfortable with. So we really have to think about attuning our language to the kinds of language and understanding the mental images that funders have about youth organizing, and not falling prey then to using a term that sort of puts them off at the outset. So, and then the other big component of emotional attunement we've talked about so far already is this idea about having to, about communicating the 2-for-1 investment and the return. The idea of individual skills building happening for the young people that are part of your program, and the systemic change happening simultaneously, that that actually helps to kind of tie back in with the outcomes that funders are looking to accomplish, particularly for the funders that may be more in that asset category that Taj talked about earlier, where they're really just thinking about individual outcomes. So I'm going to show you some examples of that. So to talk about this one piece, I want to make sure that you all know that we're not saying you can't use the term youth organizing at all. But when we tested, and this is pretty a stark finding from the survey, when we tested a variety of different ways to describe youth organizing, and asked foundation program officers how comfortable your foundation would be supporting a program or organization that describes its work this way, you can see that the most popular response was young people working together to improve their community. And it paints the clearest picture of what youth organizing is doing, actually. And it doesn't use the term organizing. Now, that what you can do is start there, and then and as part of the code switching idea, you could start there, and then over time, as you're building a relationship and you're presenting the work that you're doing and you're connecting with the program officer, then you can certainly use the term youth organizing. But we want to start with the kind of term that will create the most openness for the program officers that you're talking to. And then here's a couple of quotes, again, from different funders that we interviewed, talking about this issue of language and what terms resonate better inside their foundation. Program officers are often, as Taj alluded to, may themselves personally be more supportive than the trustees or the other colleagues in their foundation that they need to convince to support your program. So we learned a lot from talking to program officers about the ways in which they themselves are code switching within their foundation quite often. So instead of saying organizing, where it might be too scary, or people are scared of what organizing itself is, I would remove that language and use instead I would talk about maximizing leadership potential or youth leadership to improve community. There's different buzzwords at every foundation, and that's why sort of empathetic listening at the beginning of any of your conversations that you're having with funders is going to be really important. I have a client that I do fund development strategy with, and before she went to visit a group of funders in New York, I advised her to listen first instead of talking first. So we're often sort of so eager to share what we do and how amazing it is, that we just start the conversation by talking about the process of what we do in youth organizing, and we've missed a critical opportunity to listen for those buzzwords and keywords from the foundation first. So I advise my client to do as much listening as she could, that she'll be more effective in describing the work of her organizing group if she can listen first to hear what the funder cares about in terms of outcomes. And you're also listening for those key words, like how do they describe the ways in which young people are engaged in the kinds of programs that they're funding, or in the kinds of outcomes that they are seeking to accomplish. So let's go to the next concept here around emotional attunement. In the orange box, you're looking at we had a peer-to-peer funder narrative framework that we developed and tested with other funders. And as you can see from the title of that narrative framework, we used that phrase, young people working together to improve their community. And then we also said we called it a funder's perspective. And that's important because of what Scott talked about, that funders hearing from their peers, where they're aligned around their values and beliefs, and you're starting with that place of alignment, is really key for emotional attunement at the beginning. All of the stuff that we do in the messages that we tested is really about finding a way to tell a story that puts you in your empathetic brain, and puts the listener in their empathetic brain. Stories are really powerful for all of us as human beings. It's part of how we're wired for stories, in fact, in our brains. So we really have to start there with tapping into the kinds of values and underlying motivations that people care about. The other kind of key words in here that I think were really important that we learned when we tested sort of what is emotionally attuned to the target audiences is that funders got into this work because they care about creating big, lasting change. That certainly resonates with me as a youth organizer, and it's a way that you can connect with a funder, and it's the way that funder peers can connect with each other. Also, we saw that there was sort of one of the things that is happening in this moment right now that we're in the United States is that there is sort of a growing awareness of the systemic nature of problems. There's lots of reasons why that is sort of creeping into our narrative today in the country. And so there was a way in which this idea about breaking the cycle of poverty and inequity, sort of looking at larger systems and the systemic reason for the problems that young people might be facing in their individual lives or in their communities, that idea about systemic change is resonant for people right now. And that's part of what makes this moment in which we are figuring out our new narrative strategies really key. From one of the stories that we haven't talked about, one of the materials we sent you in advance was a sample newsletter story of a journey that we call it our funder journey story. It was an interview based on a real story, but it was fictionalized, an interview with a funder about how his own sort of personal journey to coming to see the value of investing in youth organizing, and the journey that his foundation had to take. And so why this worked, this Q&A, is there's a couple of reasons why it really worked and was very emotionally attuned to the target audience of the funders we're trying to persuade. So first and foremost, journey stories, which show people, in this case, this one particular funder, Tom Lee, moving from sort of being ambivalent or really not even having youth organizing on his radar screen to, by meeting the key messengers of young people that he met on a site visit, moved from ambivalence to become supportive of youth organizing. So what we're doing in the story is actually modeling the behavior that we want our own audiences that we're trying to persuade to participate in. We're sort of modeling that behavior by telling those kinds of stories. What was also really interesting about what resonated so much was this idea of the aha moment. So the funder described in his own words this aha moment that he had meeting young people who pointed him in the direction of seeing, oh, we actually need to think bigger to address root causes and to not just the symptoms of problems that we were funding quite successfully in terms of the metrics they've been looking at, but to actually get to the root causes. And this is what youth organizers are really good at. This is what we are trained to do, is to understand, analyze the root causes and not just address sort of band-aid solutions or symptoms of problems. So over time, it was messy. That aha moment wasn't just for that funder, didn't just automatically lead to 100% conversion of all of their foundation's funding now into youth organizing. There was a lot of, he had to grapple with it, and that grappling, the uncertainty of what happens even after an aha moment, really lent credibility to the story. And over time, he described that the staff at their foundation just started to realize that youth organizing was a twofer. It was this idea of simultaneous individual growth and community or policy change. They didn't have to choose. And that was a really important part of the emotional attunement around the idea that the outcomes that they were already interested in for individual young people could be accomplished simultaneous to the systemic change. So they're finally actually addressing some of those root causes. So this was a very powerful story. It was the most persuasive piece of material that we tested with funder audiences. So we wanted to share it with you. If there are ways that you in your work can share these kinds of stories, if you have a newsletter and you have a funder that's begun to support your work, and you can profile them or do a case study about that foundation's support for your work, that could be a very powerful tool, a very powerful story to tell for other funders. And then lastly, I want to just conclude with the last finding, which is that there were these specific storytelling elements in the messages that funders need to hear to understand the power of youth organizing. So just to, and some of this is a recap of what we've already talked about, the idea of the journey from ambivalence to support for youth organizing. So not having it all wrapped up and tied up and as a done deal, but actually showing, not just telling what the outcome is, that now funders are supporting you, but showing how funders traveled through that journey is really important. We talked about the right mix of characters, including funders themselves, other adults, and young people themselves telling their own stories, showing the characters grappling with challenges, and the messiness of how change occurs makes it more believable and lends to the credibility of the story, along with things like the lack of certainty. The sort of the messiness of creating change is actually one of the most important things that we show in a site visit or in a newsletter story. If we just say, young people met with the school board and they won this victory, but don't actually show the details of, like, well, what pushback did they receive from the board members, and then how did they respond to that, and how did you work through those concerns, that when you actually show the story happening in real time, or in the real ways in which it plays out, that is how funders can begin to sort of see, oh, I understand how this actually works. And to be honest, part of what we're up against is the flawed mental template that many adults have about what they think it's possible for young people to even accomplish. If you just said, look, young people won this policy change at their school board meeting, there will be adults who are unfortunately skeptical that that is even possible. So you actually, by showing how it works, you lend credibility, and you're demonstrating the power of young people actually doing the organizing. One of the other things I wanted to just highlight is that issue-specific case studies, like the one story that we tested that was focused on education outcomes, RAB is more valuable than sort of broadly showcasing content about, hey, youth organizing, this is what it is, this is the process. We also tested a video that did fairly well because it was showcasing individual young people who are sort of real, and you could really see their who they really were authentically. But it was a group of young people that worked on 5 or 6 different issues, and so it didn't land, that story or that video wasn't as effective as a single case study about a particular issue that you're working on, because again, the focus is on connecting emotionally with what the funder cares about in terms of the outcome, rather than connecting them with or trying to just showcase the process of how we do organizing. And then just again, last point is that the specific youth organizing details, how young people conducted research, negotiated with policymakers, worked with adults as collaborators, those kinds of details help to interrupt the flawed mental template that people have, that youth organizing is only about protesting in the streets. So I want to do one more activity, take one more opportunity, now that you've sort of brought together the idea about the mindsets, the messengers, and the messages, to look at 2 other funders to identify who might be persuadable. So we have funder C, the Wesley Foundation, again, fictionalized, based on a real foundation, but made fictionalized. And then funder D, the Williams Foundation. So if you just take a moment to read about these 2 funders, and then we'll sort of hear in the group chat, which one do you think is most persuadable? And then we'd love to hear your thoughts about how you would go about reaching them, especially thinking about what messengers might be useful to engage. What messages would you use? What have you identified about the outcomes that they care about from what you've read? How would you begin cultivating a relationship? Who else might you engage to help influence this particular funder? So once you've read through the two different funders, put your answer in the chat. I'm starting to see some ideas coming in on the group chat about which funder would be most persuadable, and then share your ideas about what you saw in that funder profile. Where would you start? How would you cultivate a relationship? What else would you be listening for? So far, I see most folks voting for funder C, and one for D. And then we're starting to get some suggestions about the strategies for how you would approach this particular funder based on what you've learned in the workshop today. So Gloria says funder C would be more persuadable because they have overarching goals but leave the how-to open, versus funder D, which is more focused on specific strategies like summer programs, arts education, etc. And then someone else, Barbara, has said funder D, and has suggested that having a peer support from the school district and the local arts center that has programs for youth would be an effective peer messenger on your behalf. So that's a great way of thinking about how you would engage other messengers. Rachel points out that C would likely be more persuadable because funder D uses the term at risk, which is more coming from the deficit framework. And that's a very interesting observation about kind of what are some of the key words. We tested things like vulnerable youth and vulnerable populations, which for some funders was really resonant with them, and then for others it did signal that they don't have that young people aren't civic actors, don't have power, can't have a voice. So those are some interesting observations. And you might then sort of say in a conversation with a funder, what, when you say, I noticed that you're focused on learning and enrichment for at-risk children. Can you tell me more about what that means to you as a funder? What are you looking at? And then Melody has chimed in that funder C has a lot of language that you use already to describe what you do at your organization. So that's fantastic because there's already clearly some shared language and shared alignment, and you can start from first listening to learn more. And we recommend interview. It's almost like when you go on you're building a relationship with a foundation program officer, you have an opportunity to talk to them, you're cultivating a relationship. You want to do as much listening, especially at the beginning, as you can, and then you're hearing the ways in which they're describing their work, and it aligns with how you describe your work. So that's a great jumping off point. So in the interest of time, I want to move on to the next slide. And because we're almost at the end of the presentation, I want to make sure we have as much time for Q&A. Hopefully these activities, are a useful way for you to begin to think about how the findings from our research project, you might apply them and think. Now, certainly looking at a foundation's website, all the descriptions came off of foundation websites. That's one small step that you might take, but don't want to imply that that's the only homework that you would do before you would start to cultivate a potential new funder. But it is a good place to start in terms of doing your homework. And as Scott described in his story, talking to the other funders that are already investing in your work and sort of doing some of the power mapping about who else they have relationships with is a really important part of the strategy. So we just want to leave you with some recommendations from the findings to consider for your work. If you are the person in your organization that does a lot of the fundraising, or you're going to be translating this workshop back to others in your organization, young people and other staff who do the fundraising. So here's some implications. We've just highlighted 5 of them. So to identify, first of all, identify the funders within those priority audiences that you would target based on where they are in that deficit to power spectrum. And we've talked about a number of buzzwords and ways to begin to identify where they are on that spectrum. You can also look at who they're, one of the things we didn't do on the slides, but you can also look at who are their other grantees. That's one of the best clues about as you map out kind of who in your community is getting funded by that particular foundation. You can sort of read a lot into to where they might be on that deficit to power spectrum. We'd recommend that you consider how to integrate the new narrative framework that we shared with you and the specific messages that we've highlighted into your fundraising materials. So whether that's grant proposals or the verbally what you're doing and talking with funders. And then develop and share content that reflects new messages and narrative strategy. And just to say that FCYO, Funders Collaborative and Youth Organizing is also going to be developing and sharing content. So there's an opportunity to align with what they're sharing, and whether that's in your social media or if it's in a newsletter that you generate for your organization. There's lots of ways to tell stories that will really showcase the kind of narrative that we're talking about. Making presentations or publishing op-eds and articles that use the new message and narrative strategy could be an effective way for your in your local community to inject this new narrative into the conversation that's happening. And then organizing site visits that show funders how youth organizing works, and getting that opportunity to meet with those young people who are the key messengers that we talked about. So that's another, and you may actually engage other funder peers to help you do that effectively with the funders that you're targeting. So I think what we want to do now is move into some questions and answers. And I have not been tracking, while I've been talking, have not been tracking if there's any questions in the group chat, but I think Will and Eric have been doing that if there's anything that we need to lift up and answer now. We've also prompted you with some questions on the slide here. If you want to share back in the group chat, if there's particular findings or recommendations that really resonated deeply with you, or some that challenged you, we want to hear about those as well. We started the chat at the very beginning of this presentation hearing about what's worked in your own experience about persuading different kinds of funders to support youth organizing. If you have other thoughts on that, those are welcome in the group chat. And then any reflections on maybe how you would put what you've learned today into practice, or other questions that came up for you as you heard the findings. So let's dig in. So Will and Eric, one of you have, if you've tracked any key questions that we could start with, that would be great.
Sure. Go ahead, Taj.
So one recommendation I want to add is all of you should know that there's both an inside game and an outside game. So the Funders Collaborative itself and the funders who are a part of the choir, who are the early adopters, who believe deeply in youth organizing, they already had a webinar on this. And they're trying to figure out how they're going to do their job within their institutions and with their peers to try to promote these mindsets, these strategies, and their messages. So that when you come to a foundation, they may have already heard from the collaborative. They may have already heard from a peer funder. They may have already heard those messages because your funder allies are working the inside game, right? So I think just to know that the burden of this is not all on you as a field, as organizations, but this is a partnership between your allies in philanthropy and you to kind of continue to change the thinking and shift resources and momentum. And one of the key moments in the inside-outside game are moments of transition. So a new program officer comes in, a new president comes into your local community foundation. Your local community foundation is doing strategic plan. Those are moments in which institutions are most open to influence, like early in that process. So just things to sort of think about and be aware of, because you may have spent 2 years building a relationship with the program officer. When you know that person's leaving, the thing you want to do is be the first person to be building a relationship with the person who's going to take their job so that they can build on and reinforce all of the work that you did before. So those are another piece of context. But Eric, take us into questions.
Sure. No, that was great, Taj. There's been a lot of good discussion and questions and answers on the chat, but I think two that have gotten some interest. One was about, what's the value of having, how can you utilize funders that either can't support you or can only make small grants? What are we, this idea of peer support from funders that either couldn't support us or can only support us from small grants, is that valuable? And then another question was about, do they own, how much do funders just care about the executive director? There was a question from Taryn about whether we tested, how much funders just want to know about the particular ED of the organizing group. So those were two questions that generated some interest in the chat.
Well, I'll answer the second question, and then Scott or Taj can maybe answer that first question about how to engage those other funder peers. So what we tested, interestingly, and you may have noticed this if you looked at the materials, the funder journey story doesn't mention the staff or the executive director of the peer mediation group that was so influential in shifting the mindset of the funder who was being interviewed in that story. Similarly, with the students organizing in Las Vegas around educational outcomes and access, there was no mention of the staff. And so really what we were testing was to see, the power of hearing directly from young people and having their own stories told. And so that's not to say that executive directors, many of you on the call are executive directors. We've all been, all of us who are speaking today have been or are executive directors, and certainly do a lot of the relationship building with program officers. But I think what's new and different about what we wanted to share here is that certainly you're going to have a role as an executive director. And there are some funders that care a lot about kind of who that executive director is, and they really want to know, that you are competent and capable, and there's stability with the executive director and the leadership of the organization. But just as important and what we want to emphasize here is that developing strategies to have the program officers and others in their foundation, like trustees, be able to meet young people that are doing the work on the ground and show what they're actually doing is going to be very, very powerful. So that's where site visits or the kinds of stories that you tell in a visit or in your grant proposal, or stories that you promote and share in your social media or through a newsletter, those kinds of strategies are going to be really important. So it's not just the program officer hearing from the executive director. That said, we didn't test executive director messages specifically, so we can't really comment on that. But we know that that's going to be part of the mix, and so we know executive directors will always be part of that process. We're really wanting to sort of see how do we expand beyond that to include the other voices, the other kinds of messengers that really matter to funders to hear. And then just one of my colleagues want to tackle the question about the funders that maybe can only give you a small grant, or how do they operate in the ecosystem of funders?
Or they can't fund you.
Or that can't fund you.
And then Scott has a question from Miguel that he's going to go to, and then Angela just asked a great question. So maybe we'll go folks who can't fund, Miguel's question, then Angela's question. I think the most important thing for someone who wants to be a champion, sometimes that's the person you invite to be on your board, right? So they're like, I can't fund you for my organization, but personally I really believe in you. Having that person on your board, having a funder on your board who really is a champion can be a way, or have them be a volunteer, have them make a personal donation, like just whatever they can do in whatever way. I think with any relationship you want them to map their social networks. Like, who are the people other people in philanthropy that they're in relationship to? Is there someone that they know that they could, like, just like Scott said, like when he was sort of talking about that person who made an introduction to Scott, that person's introduction to someone else in a much bigger foundation could result in more resources than them ever giving you a direct grant ever could. So you kind of think about those people as bridges, and understanding their social networks and helping them to leverage their social networks for relationship building is probably the best thing you can sort of access in that moment. But Scott, do you want to go to Miguel's question?
Yeah, it just ties right off of that. So Miguel asks, what do you do, or what do you suggest if you approach a funder, they deny you, and you want to try to keep relationships open for the future? And for me, the advice would be, one, part of this is all about our own personal practice. So like, how do you pay attention and have some empathy with the role they're in? They've said no, and stay open to staying in relationship with them. And so how do you pay attention to how you talk about what happened in the no and what you learned from it? When they say no, does someone follow back up with them and find out why they said no? And whether that's getting some critical feedback or it's just situational, how do you do that? And then I think you figure out how you get to yes at whatever the next lowest hanging piece of fruit is. It could be everything Taj just said about they believe in your work, but there's some constraint. It could be that they have something that they're waiting for. There's some other big project you might fit in. They're saying no for now, but yes later. And you need to think about it in terms of, a future potential project. It could be that you have some work to do organizationally to be able to do what they need to do, but they could be a champion for you in other ways, whether it's as a board member or writing a support or making some other contacts for you. So I think it's partly just trying to kind of mind, like any relationship building, it's just trying to figure out what those contacts are and to kind of stay after it and open to finding a way and thinking about it for kind of long-term relationship building. I hope that helps.
Yeah. So let's go to Angela's question. So Angela really, I think, raised a really important issue. What do you do when organizations that don't really do youth leadership or youth organizing essentially try to co-opt the work, co-opt the language, because there's actually more sort of interest or support in it? And you sort of see this all the time, right? A group will say, you've done all this work to get a foundation to start believing in what you do, and all of a sudden they go give a big grant to some organization that has no idea what they're doing. And that happens all the time, and it's one of the most annoying things in the world. So what can you do about that? Some of that is unavoidable. It's going to happen, and it's kind of like part of the challenge of success. But that's, I think, where having the funders who fund your work, who sort of say the Boys and Girls Club is great, but that's not really youth voice or youth leadership or youth organizing. And having this sort of criticism or feedback come from a peer funder and not from you is a great way in a community context in which there are a set of funders who are all working together. Because someone doing that should be embarrassed. And to be clear, some of the foundations that we work with that understand what organizing is, but are perhaps funding work in a bunch of different communities where there's different kinds of stuff going on, we've had to deal with some of that. I think getting other funder peers who can kind of establish some rigor and standards around what we're talking about, and just calling a banana an apple doesn't make it a banana. You can't just do that. That does work that way. But I want to affirm my shared frustration with you on that point, because I've seen that happen far too many times.
Do we have time real quick to pull in one last question from Elizabeth?
Yeah, I was just going to say that draws to that question, because I think it's a really great one.
Go ahead.
The question is, this may be outside the realm you tested, but how does code switching impact relationships in the long term? How does it impact accountability towards deliverables? And I think part of what I hear this question getting at least for myself, that I'd love to hear you all reflect on is, right, we can talk about code switching as a good thing, but I think for many organizers, there's a concern, if I start switching my language too much, am I still accountable to my community? Right. And, what does that mean to start shifting the language? If I stop saying youth organizing or stop saying other things that are important, how does that affect our work? And what have you learned about, how to employ those kinds of changes in language?
I have a quick piece on this, because I think really, if you look at what the findings are, what we're saying really clearly is you don't want to say anything that's not true, and you don't want to say anything that's not central. You essentially want to give the description without the word, right? So when you look at what tests well is describing what youth organizing is without saying the word youth organizing. So it's kind of like I have an apple, and I'm like, you can have this apple, you just can't use the word apple. You can describe it using any other language you want to use. You just can't use the word apple. You can call it a manzana. You can call it apple in a different language. You just can't use the English word apple. If you don't use that word, you can have the apple. So the thing itself is itself. It's just not using words that trigger the stereotypes that basically kind of close the door before the conversation even starts. So when we say code switching, like that's really at the heart of what we're talking about. But I don't know if other folks have things you would add to that.
Well, I would add because it's a both and, or it's a lot to try to hold. So for me, if folks aren't familiar, there's this author, Lisa Delpit, in Education Circles, who wrote a book called Other People's Children. And she wrote about codes of power, and that there's a difference when codes of power are not named, ignored, and not taught versus when they're made explicit and you're given access. And that doesn't justify or condone that they exist. It's recognizing that they exist and how to navigate them. And I think here it's like programs that are focused on building like bicultural leadership and identity development. You're rooted in your own community, you know what your true North values are, and you're learning a language and a discourse that opens up the resources. This is the Apple thing Taj just talked about. We didn't test it. We don't have an answer about it. I can see the feelings around, what could feel like that. And that, particularly the question around impact on accountability towards deliverables, because is it possible that in the switching back and forth, you've somehow gotten to a point where you're actually misunderstanding what you're going to deliver and what they think delivery is going to look like? I think that's a really rich question to keep chewing on, because that would seem like the sweet spot is figuring out how do you hold those things. But I do think it's a balance of be explicit about what you're doing, know why. You don't have to condone it, but unlock those resources with that Apple so that you can keep doing the bigger transformational work.
And I'll answer by telling just two quick stories. One is that I have a client that I work with where we identified a potential funder. It was a corporate foundation interested in service learning opportunities for young people. That's not at all how the organization I'm working with describes its work. So we took a proposal for one of their programs and literally did a cut and paste, like cut and replace with wherever it said youth leadership, and we put in service learning. And the funder had rejected them in the past, but this year funded them close to $60,000 for their program, which is a really significant chunk of change for their work. And so in that case, I would say that was really, we were very clearly employing a short-term strategy to use the language, not to talk about youth organizing or even youth leadership, but to frame the work that they were doing as service learning. Nothing changed about the programs that they delivered or the outcomes that they're accomplishing with the young people that they're working with, but they have more funding. And so that was a very clear short-term strategy. Long-term, however, I think the story that to me is more that means more to me is what happened with that funder journey story that we tested in the materials in our interviews and our surveys is based on a real story. So the foundation went through a longer term transformation. It took several years, but they ultimately shifted from funding peer mediation programs, which are, which involve service learning and direct service, to becoming a youth organizing funder. So they moved along that spectrum of social diffusion from being, they sort of were one of the early adopters, and now they're actually a champion of the field of youth organizing. So we're not saying that you can't move funders along that spectrum that we talked about, from deficit to asset to voice to power. But it would take a significant amount of time. And we wanted to be realistic in this presentation with the real challenges that face all of you to raise money today for the programs that you're working on. And simultaneously, I think you have a great partner in FCYO that will also be working on finding ways to shift more funders towards real support, meaningful support around youth organizing over the long term. I want to kick it back over to Eric just to close us out and say, to conclude the webinar today.
Great, thank you so much. I mean, this has been really valuable. I hope folks have gotten a lot out of this conversation. We hope that these tools will be really useful to you in the fundraising work that all of you are doing. You know, and just know that we at FCYO are really committed to doing everything that we can do. As Taj said, we're going to be taking the findings that came from this report, and we're going to be finding more ways to share them with your groups so that you can use them, so that you can use these tools in your outreach to individual foundations. And we're also going to be using them internally to inform communications and funder advocacy strategy that we're going to be implementing. And we hope that by, you know, us reinforcing some of these messages with funders and organizing funder peers to do it, and the work that you're doing directly, we hope that we'll be able to really try to increase long-term support for this work over a number of years. And I think the last thing that that I'll just emphasize is that I think many of us, we know this thing about changing language for funders. We know it's a good idea, and I think many of us feel like we do it already. And when we talk to funders, we've often found that we don't do it as well as we think we're doing it, is one of the, and that's what I've learned myself as a fundraiser. And Taj told the story before about a large funder who, we wrote a whole big proposal about, supporting the youth organizing field. And finally they came back to us and said, but Eric, we don't support youth organizing. We support racial justice, right? And once I could figure out, so I think we all know this thing about switching language. We all think we do it. And I think there's something for us to go back and look at ourselves and think, are we really doing it? Are we really listening to the funders and really switching our language as well as we could? And that to me was the biggest lesson that came out of this. And so I hope that again, that we'll be able to support the efforts that you're doing, to be able to organize funders, to be peer advocates that are reaching out to other funders, and that by doing all of that together, we'll be able to really build some long-term support for this critical work. And I, again, just want to say that there's a lot of us out there that do realize how important the work that you all are doing on the ground is, and are committed to trying to figure out how we build resources for it. And just want to thank you for doing that. And I want to thank the folks who've been speaking today, Taj and Scott and Carolyn. I think this has been really useful. And again, the slides and the PowerPoint will be posted on our website in a few days. And if there's anything else that we can do to support you all in your work, definitely let us know. But again, thanks to our presenters, and thanks to everyone for joining.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Take care.